Hello, this is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high-quality racing oil for your two-stroke or four, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support. Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazer, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at Kawasaki's all-new KX250 for 1992. Now, this is a machine I've never personally ridden, although I do have a fair amount of experience on the very similar 1993 model. My best buddy Trenton bought a 93 KX brand new, and I was actually really liked that bike in a lot of ways, although I think the one thing I didn't care for was the handling on it. I remember at the time I was riding Hondas, and the suspension on this bike was just mind-blowingly better than what was on my CR. My 1990 had crappy suspension on it, and no matter, I had it revalved and fiddled with it constantly. I never could get it really to work that well. And bone stock, this Kawasaki just blew it out of the weeds. You'd hit stuff and stuff that would like jam your wrist on the Honda. You wouldn't even feel it on the Kawasaki. It was amazing how much better the KX's suspension was in the CR. And this 92 is very similar to the 93. 93 did have a little more power. One of the beefs you'll see in the test here is the 92 wasn't particularly fast. It had a real mellow style of power in 91 and 92. And I think 93, they really brought a lot more hit back to the engine, but the overall handling was still very freight train-like, especially coming off a Honda. You jump on the Cowie and the suspension's like way better in this generation of KX. It felt like to me, like the front end didn't have enough steering lock and it just wouldn't turn very well. And it was just a weird situation where it just felt like the front end was doing something that the rest of the bike wasn't really ready for. Kind of a weird deal. I think if you rode it all the time, obviously you got used to it. I mean, you look at Rocco and Kudrowski and these guys, they went really fast on these bikes. They did really well. But if you came off like an RM or a CR and jumped on this Kawasaki, it just felt like it didn't want to turn. And that really was the only beef. I mean, 92 in particular, the motor was not super fast and the chassis was not really willing to turn, but if you're going to go fast on a motocross track, high speed handling was excellent. Suspension was just like so much better than everybody else. It was a great machine in a lot of ways. And this bike was the second generation of Kawasaki's perimeter frame. They'd come out with the all-new bike in 1990 and kind of blew everybody's minds a little bit. That first bike was super cool, but there were issues with some of the reliability of the frame. It also had some handling quirks because the chassis was a little bit flexy in places, and also had kind of some ergonomic issues too, where the steering head was really tall and wide. It made the bike kind of feel tall and top-heavy. They addressed a lot of that here in 1992. They redesigned the frame, made it much smaller. It still was much bigger than a CR or any other competition. If you jump on this bike off of something else, it had a very different feel. Felt tall and long and just kind of unique to a Kawasaki at the time. And all these 90s KXs with the early perimeter frames had kind of that feel. They just have a very different kind of ergonomic package than the other machines. I think tall people liked it a little more. I'm only 5'8", so it always felt like a little big to me. The CR fit me better. But it was a really good machine in the early 90s here. These KXs definitely won a lot of races. I mean, like I said, Kawasaki was doing really well on the track at the time. And maybe in the shootouts, they weren't always winning. But I think for most riders who are, really riding on a local track, it was a really good machine. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done. I've done many other Kawasaki reviews, shootout reviews. I just did a review on the 125 class of 1987. A great lineup of machines I also had several of. If you'd like to support what I do, I have Motocross Vault merch available. I just came out with an all-new design. Somebody had actually requested that I do based on the 1988 CR125. I had an 87 CR. A good buddy of mine had the 88. I was never really a huge fan of this change in 88 when they went to the all-red design, but I think now it's very iconic and cool. So I made this shirt up. It's available in shirts, t-shirts, sweatshirts, stickers, all kinds of versions of it. If you want to check it out on my channel, it is available. I will put a card here in the video and a link in the description below, again, if you'd like to support what I do. So here, without further ado, is the story of the 1992 Kawasaki KX250. The early 1990s were a great time for Kawasaki. After numerous struggles in the 70s and early 80s, the Green team came roaring back with a succession of ever-improving machines in the mid to late 80s. After over a decade of being the doormat of the motocross industry, Team Green transformed itself into a legitimate contender, with solid machines that produced class-leading power and excellent suspension. In 1990, Kawasaki made its boldest statement yet with the introduction of the industry's first perimeter-framed motocross machines. The all-new KX125 and KX250 shed several years of quirky and conservative styling in favor of an all-new look that appeared to be a decade ahead of its predecessors. This radical redesign caught the imagination of the public and press alike, and propelled the new KXs to major success on the newsstands and in Kawasaki showrooms. On the track, the 1990 KX250 proved to be a solid contender, with excellent suspension and a blisteringly fast motor. The new perimeter frame chassis looked amazingly trick, but made the bike tall and wide, and some riders struggled with its Paul Bunyan feel and unique handling. There were also durability issues tied to the removable alloy shock mounts the frame used, but overall, the new perimeter frame KX250 proved to be a huge success for the brand. After the laurels Kawasaki received in 1990, they were content to focus on refinement for the KX250 in 1991. The large feel remained, but Kawasaki made several changes aimed at smoothing out the power and further refining the suspension. The new motor settings took away the 1990 model's explosive hit and replaced it with a mellower delivery that pulled over a wider RPM range. This smoother power delivery was less intimidating to control, but also far less exciting to ride. Less skilled pilots liked the more manageable power band, but fast guys limited the lack of hit the new motor provided. The more lethargic delivery and softer suspension settings for 91 only exacerbated the machine's hefty feel, and most riders felt the KX was in need of a power boost and a downsizing program to keep up with its rivals. After only 2 years in the market, Kawasaki was ready to introduce another all-new machine for 1992. The new machine maintained the perimeter frame layout of 91, but made several significant changes aimed at addressing the complaints riders had voiced the 2 previous years. One issue with the first-generation frame had been its unpredictability. Certain situations seemed to confuse the chassis, and the bike's front end could not always be trusted to follow its intended path, in spite of the machine's rather aggressive geometry. Kawasaki traced this issue back to the bolt-on shock mounts, which allowed the backbone of the frame to flex under extreme loads. To address this and alleviate the cracking issues many riders had also witnessed, the new frame employed a more traditional welded-on steel mount for the shock. In addition to the new shock mount, the new frame enjoyed increased bracing behind the motor as well as a stronger gusseting of the steering stem and the lower frame rails. The swing arm pivot was enlarged as well, and a beefed-up swing arm was bolted on to further fight chassis flex. To improve ergonomics and lessen the old bike's top-heavy feel, both the steering head and main frame spars were mounted lower for 1992. The new spars were narrower as well, to further reduce the KX's oversized feel. Overall geometry was changed as well, with the new chassis enjoying a half-degree more rake and a half-inch more wheelbase to improve stability. Mated to the new frame was a redesigned unitrack rear suspension system and a majorly revised Kawasaki front fork. For 1992, the linkage was all new and featured a more progressive curve for smoother action. The shock remained a Kawasaki unit, but the overall length of the damper was increased, and all new valving was installed. Up front, Kawasaki once again handled the damping duties with a set of inverted 43mm cartridge forks carrying over from 1991. While the forks were very similar to the year before, revised damping and stiffer springs promised improved performance. When redesigning the KX's chassis, one of the main goals of the engineers had been to improve the ergonomics and handling feel of the machine. The first-generation KX had placed the tank very high in the chassis, and the overall width of the bike was noticeably more than its rivals. For 1992, Kawasaki repositioned the tank much lower on the frame and reshaped the seat to aid rider movement. The entire rider compartment was flatter and slimmer, and getting forward for turns was much easier than the year before. New radiator shrouds fully enclosed the lower fuel tank, and redesigned side plates offered a sleeker profile. Graphically, the new KX was cleaner than 1991, with a more understated look that flowed from the shrouds directly into the seat. Like 1991, the forks remained an anodized blue that some riders liked and others despised. One area where Kawasaki had always been an innovator was in the braking field. They were the first manufacturer to move to a front disc in 1982, and the first to add a rear disc 4 years later in 1986. For 1992, they once again tried to trump the field by completely redesigning the front braking system on their KX250. The all-new 92 design moved away from the traditional fixed rotor and floating caliper to a full floating design Kawasaki had been employing on their works machines. The new full floating arrangement was designed to allow the rotor and caliper to self-center and provide the maximum contact area at all times. In the rear, Kawasaki stayed with a traditional rotor design, but did increase the size of the piston, added new pads, redesigned the heat insulator, and revised the ratio of the lever for 1992. On the motor front, Kawasaki dialed up an all-new engine for 1992. In 1991, the best motor in motocross was the one found in Honda's CR250R. The CR's amazing blend of smooth delivery and epic thrust was unparalleled in the off-road world. It came on at the first crack of throttle and never stopped pulling. For 1992, Kawasaki's aim was to beef up the low-to-mid power of their KX250 while maintaining the 91 model's Honda-like ease of use. In order to accomplish this, Kawasaki rearranged the bore and stroke of the KX to mimic the exact dimensions found in the 1991 CR. This new longer stroke configuration was paired with a rebalanced crank and an all-new cylinder for 92. The cylinder, head, pistons, and lower cases were all new as well to accommodate the revised internal dimensions. The new motor maintained the three-stage Kawasaki Integrated Power Valve System, or KIPS, it had used since 1988, but changed the main exhaust valve to a guillotine style for better sealing. To increase durability, a new piston was added that was coated with Nicosil on its skirts, and the clutch was beefed up in size. Transmission ratios remained unchanged, but third through fifth gears were strengthened for increased reliability. Ignition duties were handled by a new dual-generator coil that separated the spark control between low and high RPM, and a revised intake system that increased the volume of the airbox, air boot, and filter for 1992. Finishing off the motor package was an all-new exhaust designed to bring back some of the KX's lost top-end power. On the track, the new Kawasaki KX250 proved to be a highly competitive machine with a few peccadillos. If you came to the party looking for the fastest, hardest hitting, and sharpest turning machine in the class, you are going to be disappointed. In spite of its all-new motor, the 92 KX remained far more mellow than any of its competition. The new motor started pulling very early and kept pulling over a very broad range, but it lacked any hint of burst or hit. The overall power band mimicked the 1991 CR, but without the Honda's verve. It was closer to an enduro-style power band than a typical motocross mauler, and most riders found it pleasant but fairly boring to ride. That is not to say it was not competitive, however, as the bike remained deceptively fast. Much like the 88 CR250 had been, the new KX was sneaky fast and actually capable of running with its rivals most of the time. Deep loam and sand were an issue, but on hard-packed tracks, the KX's long and smooth power band was a bonus. Its dramaless delivery made it seem slower than it really was, and it liked to hook up and haul while its rivals spun their tires in a display of machismo bravado. For fast guys, a bit of motor work was a must, but for most riders, the KX was more than capable of winning with the stock engine in place. While the motor was somewhat controversial in 1992, the KX's suspension was anything but. The revised 43mm Kawasaki forks punched out 12.2 inches of travel and offered adjustments for both compression and rebound damping. On the track, they were unparalleled in their ability to gobble up rough terrain, and in 1992, nothing was as plush as the front end of the Kawasaki KX250. Big hits and small were absorbed in stride, and the forks suffered none of the harshness felt on the RM and CR's front ends. Really fast or heavy guys probably needed heavier springs, but for 90% of the racing populace, the KX's forks were dialed to perfection. Out back, the picture was just as rosy, with the KX's Unitrack delivering nearly flawless damping performance. Braking bumps and holes on the track literally disappeared under the KX's silky smooth operation. The all-new Kawasaki damper swallowed whoops and laughed off square edge bumps that would have had a Honda pilot searching for a second kidney belt. On a rough track, the KX's suspension prowess was a huge advantage, and that advantage only grew as the track deteriorated. As with the forks, the shock was a bit soft for pro-level guys, but even they loved its performance. In 1992, there was a lot of griping about suspension performance in the 250 class, but not a single one of those gripes was leveled at the Green Machine. On the handling front, the KX benefited greatly from its awesome suspension, but its overall feel remained a bit of a mixed bag. At 212.3 pounds, the redesigned KX250 was actually the lightest bike in the class, but it continued to not feel that way. On the scale, it tallied in at a half-pound lighter than the feathery-feeling CR250, but on the track it felt closer in weight to the portly 230-pound KTM. Some of this was probably due to its slow-feeling motor and relatively soft suspension, and some of it remained tied to its jumbo-sized chassis. In spite of a Jenny Craig treatment for 1992, the KX remained a large and long-feeling bike. The steering head felt like it was way out there, and the rider compartment was stretched out compared to the compact feel of its rivals. Riders over 6 feet continued to love the KX's spacious layout, but most average-sized pilots thought it made the bike a bit harder to throw around. Where the KX's large feel, slack geometry, and ultra-plush suspension paid major dividends was its speed. Rough, high-speed sections were a no-drama affair on the KX, and it could be trusted to follow its intended path without any sudden hops, kicks, or shakes. The excellent suspension and stout chassis made the Kawasaki the king of whooped-out straights, and the KX could be trusted in situations that would have had a Honda or Suzuki pilot puckered up like a lemon. Where things went a bit astray for the new KX was in the turning department. The new chassis was stronger and less prone to flex, but it was still far less nimble than any of its Japanese competition. Compared to the CR, the KX felt like a chopper with a raked-out front end that was in some other zip code. On flat ground, the Kawasaki exhibited an incessant front-end push, and the front wheel never really communicated what it was doing with any accuracy. Turning the front wheel felt more like a suggestion than a command, and the KX much preferred going straight to changing direction. On hardpack, the Green Machine had to be manhandled to get around turns that a CR or RM pilot could execute in their sleep. Even the only moderately nimble YZ could turn rings around the barge-like Kawasaki. With a berm and a ton of rider input, the Kawasaki could be made to turn, but it was far happier sweeping the outside than trying to dive underneath any of its rivals. On the detailing side of things, the KX was innovative but slightly unrefined. The new full-floating front disc brake was Works' bike trick, but ended up offering highly mediocre performance. It exhibited a mushy feel at the lever and a disappointing bite on the track. A switch to Motul fluid and constant bleeding made a minor improvement, but the feel of the brake never offered the firm and confident action of Honda's class-leading binders. Ironically, many riders found that the easiest fix for the marshmallow lever feel was to ditch the work-style rotor entirely and mount up the old solid-mounted rotor instead. This greatly reduced the mushiness at the lever, but even with this change, the KX remained a very middling braking performer. Chassis reliability was increased for 1992 with the deletion of the failure-prone upper shock mounts, but the KX continued to offer the worst assortment of fasteners in the business. Seat bolts, subframe mounts, and the bike's other assorted hardware were easily stripped or broken if care was not taken with their assembly or removal. The bars, chain, and sprockets were also utter junk that lasted about as long as a snow cone on a SoCal summer day. Continuing a long line of leakers, the KX's gas cap also maintained its tradition of drooling high test if it was tightened too firmly. The foot pegs also tended to droop after extended use, but at least they started out as by far the best platforms in the business. The foot peg springs, however, were less commendable, and they were notable for their predilection to go missing at inopportune moments. In terms of reliability, the motor was slow, but at least it was mostly trouble-free. Aside from an issue some early KXs had with the Nickel coating flaking off the piston, the motor was quite dependable. A mid-year update fixed the coating, and most KXs lived on happily with only minimal maintenance. If you wanted more power, a switch to a Boysen rad valve, an aftermarket exhaust, and a lowering of the gearing helped the KX motor immensely. While it was never going to be as fast as the new Honda, without any major motor work, at least it was competitive and easy to ride with only minor upgrades. Overall, the 1992 KX250 proved to once again be one of the most unique offerings in motocross. Its jumbo ergonomics and superb suspension seemed tailor-made for a larger rider that was likely to find its lazy motor disappointing. In an era where supercross was becoming the de facto standard for motocross handling, the KX was a bit of a throwback to a time when high speeds and rough terrain were the targets. Big, soft, and comfy, the KX made mincemeat of high-speed tracks with its freight train-like stability, a predictable motor, and magic carpet suspension. For tight tracks and McGrath-style heroics, there were certainly better choices available. But if suspension excellence, comfort, and ease of use were on your wish list, then the 1992 KX250 had just what the doctor ordered. So there you have it. That's a look back at the 1992 KX250, a machine that wasn't really the darling of the press in 92. I think a lot of people had issue with the maybe mellow motor, and again, the turning was definitely not great. I definitely had issues with that. Like I said, when I get on my buddy's 93, you go into a turn and I'd expect it to dive, and I remember just yanking the bars and the front end just pushes like a terrible understeer. That's one of the things you get used to. You just really have to kind of change the way you ride the bike. You have to plan your lines a little differently, maybe sweep the outside more. Just wasn't really capable of taking the same lines on the track you would on like an RM or a CR, but as long as you understood that, you adjusted your riding, it was a really competitive machine and a great motorcycle in so many ways. Again, the suspension on these early 90s KXs is just quantum leaps better than anything else that was out at the time. And it was a big advantage. You know, if your main thing you're looking for is suspension prowess, there really only was one bike. The Kawasaki just had everybody else covered. So depending on what you're looking for, this was an excellent choice in 1992. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done. If you could like, subscribe, share on social media, I would really appreciate it. Help grow the channel. And until we meet again, this is Tony Blaze from Motocross Vault. Keep the rubber side down. Peace.